I've also had 4 hours sleep in the last 36 hours, so maybe it's an Australian thing. So I'm actually going to read, and I have to apologise in advance for that, but I don't feel that my brain is working sufficiently for such an historically important day to just rely on that with no sleep. So I'm going to talk about the importance of Ted's vision and also the evolution of that vision and where the components of it came from. Sometimes a journey makes itself necessary, as Anne Carson puts it in Autobiography of Red. For Nelson, it's been a long journey, at times a very difficult one, but it's been necessary. It's been necessary for him personally. As he puts it in Posseplex, I have no alternative but to go on. Like Shackleton of Antarctica, I find myself enmeshed in a harsh duty that was not the original plan. I will fight for it to my last breath. He has survived the journey so far, his ideals held high above the mud. But as this conference demonstrates, as the people who've spoken today have demonstrated, the journey's also been necessary for the computing world. Nelson's vision is, I think, the most important vision in the history of computing, and that's quite a tall call to make considering the contenders. So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk explaining my reasoning. In my book Memory Machines, and by the way, if anyone wants a copy of it, just email me and I'll fix you up. I argue that the idea of a universal digital archive and publishing system, an open hypermedia system, originated with Nelson. Vannevar Bush's vision, though it was certainly about connected items, was analogue. Engelbart's vision was also profoundly important, and that's another lecture unto itself. He was first to build many of the things that we take for granted in modern computing, and I don't mean the mouse, I mean the whole concept of networked, interactive, real-time computing. But he was not thinking about hypertext as a domestic thing, as something that your mum would consume over latte in a cafe. He didn't write singing commercials for his vision either. What Nelson saw was an anarchic, global hypertext publishing system, a digital repository scheme for worldwide electronic publishing, he puts it in Literary Machines. While working at Harcourt in 1966, he dubbed it Xanadu. Now, Nelson had a rich vision for what Xanadu should look like and the experience it should deliver to the public. The design went through many iterations, which are best explained in Literary Machines. They varied in their details, but all contained intercomparison or the reuse of elements, which is transclusion, in some form. I'll talk about how these ideas evolved briefly here. Now, the vision started in 1960, and Nelson tends to get cranky at me when I start in 1965 because that's the first published record. And historians like bits of paper created at the time, as well as oral history and human memory. The designs, he told me in 2011, had been swirling in my head for 5 years before then. So I'm going to be starting in 1960 today, but I want to stress that this is based on Nelson's recollections in Literary Machines and his autobiography and on our interviews. I'd very much like to go through Nelson's archives one day, he knows this, and find a sketch or term paper from 1961. Nelson has actually shown me tantalising video footage of a box of file cards from the 60s, which you'll see today. And that's a bit like watching porno for a media historian. So in 1960, Nelson did a term writing project for the IBM 7090. This was the only computer at Harvard at the time, and it was stored in a big air-conditioned room in the Smithsonian Observatory. And that would have cost a couple of million to $2.5 million back then. And it wouldn't have had a screen, and this is something I was talking to Dick Heiser about before. So Nelson believes he saw one in a manual at one point in 1960, a screen for the 1790. I'm happy to be corrected. I just don't see how that would have occurred, but I believe you, Ted. I do believe you.
I found the manual online, and the picture was not in.
Yeah.
I did see pictures in tech literature showing happy people sitting at screens, and that was part of it.
In 1960, okay. Yep, all right. So in Posiplex, he writes a few words, a few pictures of people at computer screens, and the understanding that computer prices would fall. These gave me all I needed to know, a crystal seed from which to conjure a whole universe. So in 1960, Nelson proposed a machine language program to store documents in the computer, change them on a screen with various editorial operations, and print them out. But this was no mere word processor, which in any case didn't exist at the time. Nelson actually suggested that you would be able to compare versions on screen, change them with various editorial operations. So he was basically suggesting intercomparison at this time. Now, intercomparison was a radical idea to dream up in 1960, when computers were for very serious people, namely engineers, to solve serious problems. So at that time, people were computing with cards. A terminal was a teletypewriter used by an operator who put in cards and tore off the printouts. In the mid-60s, you could, as I was talking to Dick Heiser about, if you're rich enough, acquire a glass teletype that kind of acted like a teletype. But I don't think that would have been available in 1960. If anyone in the audience knows different, feel free to correct me. The second part of Nelson's vision took shape in the early 1960s. At this point, his project was not so much a design, he stressed when I asked for records. Once again, I think I must annoy him sometimes with my desire for bits of paper. He said it was an idea that may have been on only one file card. At this stage, he devised what he called the 1,000 Theories program, an explorable computer-assisted instruction program that would allow the user to study different subjects by taking different trajectories through a network of information. In Literary Machines, he writes, this idea rather quickly became what I would eventually call hypertext. This led to another idea, which Nelson drafted as an academic paper while teaching sociology at Vassar College in 1965. That would become the first publication, which is why I like to cite it. And it would also become the transclusive relationship, namely zigzag, to turn into zigzag, sorry. So in his 1965 paper for the ACM, A File Structure for the Complex, the Changing and the Indeterminate, Nelson proposed a display-based computer system that permitted linking between documents and the reuse of elements, called zippered lists. Again, this was a time when the whole idea of text on a screen was seen as a waste of processing power, let alone weird-ass, non-sequential text. In 1965, unless you were working on Engelbart's team, or could afford a system with videotype display, Nelson reasons it would cost less than a secretary in his paper at $37,000 in 1965 money, which would be a well-paid secretary. Computers were expensive things with more important things to do. For most organisations, they still didn't have screens. I should also stress that in 1965, text was not data. It was something academics and journalists manipulated with typewriters. As Doug Engelbart told me in 1999, the whole concept of a human being sitting in an interactive feedback loop with a computer, manipulating symbols on a screen, was foreign to most people in the 60s. He said it was wacky even in the 70s when we had it working, real hypermedia, real groupware working. As some very eminent speakers have discussed today, this was a paradigm problem Nelson would later take on in his book Computer Lib. So I guess what I'm saying here is that although the declaration was best made with a raised fist and capital letters in Computer Lib, it had been brewing for him since 1960. Now in 1965, he published his zippered list design. And that paper, when you think about what a computer was at the time, had chutzpah. He called this design the evolutionary list file, or ELF. In his autobiography, Nelson reflects that ELF was strange and hard to understand. In fact, it was quite bad. It did, however, include facilities to compare versions of a document and reuse elements from these versions. Both of these ideas would make their way into Xanadu in some form. But the zippered list in particular would eventuate in a deliverable 30 years later, Zigzag. In that same 1965 paper, Nelson claimed that computers would eventually do the dirty work of personal file and text handling. Needless to say, personal computing has happened. The dirty work is now done by clunky programs like Microsoft Word, programs Nelson has a go at every now and then, not because he's a cranky one-note Samba fellow who can't find another idea to push and should have moved on by now, as one programmer put it in a Lambda the Ultimate blog post, but because the computing world could be completely different. That's always been his message, even in the 60s. In 67, having seen Engelbart's NLS, Nelson went on to predict a network structure of information that would be read from an illuminated screen, the cathode ray display. It will respond or branch upon actions by the user. It will be a succession of displays that come and go according to his actions. That succession of displays that respond and branch has also happened. It's hard to imagine a world without it, actually. The idea that the Xanadu system should be an open or shared access publishing system, what this talk is really about, also started in the 60s. Although in 67 he envisioned a sort of super executives console, which was self-contained, he writes in Literary Machines that in 1967 the idea of communicating between consoles was beginning to get through to me, and the nagging issue of shared access began to grow on me. It may have been growing on Nelson, but as I've said, the computing world really wasn't about to swallow the idea of a global hypertext publishing system. Work had not even started on the ARPANET, though Ivan Sutherland and Bob Taylor had been thinking about it for some time. The computing establishment was still trying to grapple with the concept of a person sitting in front of a computer screen and manipulating symbols, after Doug's mother of all demos in 1968. Now, there was an attempt to build a part of Nelson's vision at Brown University in 1967, and that did result in a unique and historically important standalone system called the hypertext editing system. I'm not going to go into that any further here, however. This is Ted's party and I don't want to poop it. If you're interested, you can find it in my book. I'll just say that it didn't happen the way he wanted it to happen. Nelson had also met Engelbart and seen his landmark NLS system by 1967. The friendship would last until Engelbart's recent death. Although Nelson had initially thought this meeting happened in 1967, he found some notes while writing Posiplex and realised it was in 1966. Those notes have since been lost. He thought Engelbart was warm and wonderful upon first meeting him, though he didn't like the hierarchical structure of Engelbart's system. Nelson and Engelbart were close. They understood each other on multiple levels. In his passionate eulogy for his friend, Nelson said, "I don't just feel like I've lost my best friend, I feel like I've lost my best planet." I might add here, in a sense, Nelson is now all alone. It was Nelson and Engelbart, and now it's just Nelson. Although their visions were different, they also shared some similar life experiences. Firstly, Engelbart and Nelson watched their ideas spread around the globe, then re-emerge as someone else's interpretation, an approximation of a vision. This has upsides and downsides. I remember putting it to Nelson once in Melbourne when he was getting a bit despondent about his life, that he has inspired so many people. He told me immediately that this was never his intention, and that the problem with inspiring people is that they then try to credit you with things you don't like. Engelbart and Nelson have also lived through resistance. Resistance to those original visions in the 60s. I don't want to dwell on this, but I think it does need to be said at this conference. There have not always been conferences held in Nelson or Engelbart's honour. Although Engelbart, as an engineer with a prestigious post at SRI, had more basis for conversation with the computing mainstream, what he was doing was not seen as science back then either. As the head of engineering at SRI told a young Bill Duval, who then recounted to me, "You don't really think what they're doing up there is science, do you?" That kind of resistance has dogged Nelson for many years. People didn't understand what he was going on about, and neither Ted nor his vision seemed to fit into any one nice explanatory box. As The Economist put it in 1986, boon or boondoggle, nobody is quite sure. Discussion of Xanadu still positions his work in left field. As we've seen today, in 1974, in ComputerLib, he took his idea to the public in the hope that he may have better luck there. He argued that computers are mere changeable devices for twiddling symbols that should power this new all-singing, all-dancing media experience for everyone. As we've seen today, it was a rallying cry to that cause. One of the main things I want to emphasise in my talk is that for many years it was up to Nelson to promote the idea of a worldwide hypertext publishing system. It may be self-evident or even pedestrian today, but it certainly wasn't in the 60s, 70s, right into the 80s. People were still building workstation-based hypertext systems. HyperCard, the elephant in the pre-web hypertext room that introduced the concept of linking to the general public, was a standalone system. Note cards, guide, none of these were globe-spanning open publishing systems. Even in the 80s, it seemed wacky. In a 1988 paper called Hypertext, the Manifest Destiny of Literature, Nelson writes, hopeful as ever, "The key problem is to create a universal literary medium, an unbounded storage and delivery system as simple in concept as the book and library, unrestricted as to what screens you may see it on, unrestricted in its organisation." So it wasn't obvious, even then, in 1988. It wasn't obvious that it was needed and that it was about to happen. It was not until the web, as Jay Boulder put it to me in an interview, it was not until the web that people really saw and understood that the really interesting things happen when your links can cross from one computer to another, from one continent to another. Then it all became rather obvious. In 1999, Nelson told me, "The web is a universal, worldwide, anarchic publishing system." It completely vindicated my 35 years, now 50 years, of saying that a universal, worldwide, anarchic publishing system would be of enormous human benefit. There is no question of whether it's of benefit, it just does it all wrong. That's all. Somewhere around 1993, Nelson found he no longer had to convince people that such a network was possible. You just had to switch on your machine to see that it was. His task changed to convincing people that Xanadu would be better. I should add here, if it isn't obvious by now, that I believe him. But I've learnt a lot from studying the history of hypertext. The first is that hypertext is not the web. The web is one implementation of hypertext. People have been building and designing hypertext systems decades before the web arrived, and many of them did things the web just doesn't do. Xanadu in particular still has much to offer us. The web is great in that it actually works for most people, most of the time, and it has stayed the course for 25 years. It is not, however, the only way hypertext can be done. So back to the title of my talk, the importance of a guiding vision. The remarkable thing about Xanadu is that despite countless setbacks, it refuses to die. Its logo is, appropriately enough, as was shown before, the eternal flaming X. Paisley and Butler have noted that scientists and technologists are guided by images of potentiality, the untested theories, unanswered questions, and unbuilt devices that they view as their agenda for 5 years, 10 years, and longer. Often accused of hand-waving and lucid dreaming, Nelson's Xanadu has nonetheless become inherited vision. But engineering discourse has always privileged prototypes over ideas, things that are concrete. working prototypes, working algorithms, real deliverables that you can see in action. The same might be said for computing science. As Vincent Childress put it, the main criteria applied to engineered technological solutions is that they work, or more precisely, that they are seen to work. For this reason, I think people have been able to write off the Xanadu vision as a pipe dream, particularly Gary Wolfe in his scathing Wired article. But the thing about the process of invention and innovation is that vision and prototype work in unison. They work together. Without an image of potentiality, the untested theory, the unbuilt device, the unanswered question, innovation becomes a process of stabbing around in the dark. But you have to pick your vision and your visionary carefully. You would want that vision to solve a problem you think people are facing, for example. Incidentally, the reason why Engelbart had flashes of himself sitting at a Memex-like device while he was driving home from work one day in 1950, a flash that changed the world. You would want that visionary to be right, at least some of the time, about what the future might hold. You would also want it to be technically feasible. And by that I mean extrapolating from the devices and ways of doing things available to me right now. Can I build it one day? Most importantly, you would want it to be guiding you somewhere beneficial. And on that note, I'll leave the last piece of my talk to Engelbart. As Nelson put it in his eulogy, no one ever had such a soaring view of human potential as Douglas Carl Engelbart. He gave us wings to soar with, though his mind flew on ahead where few could see. This is an excerpt from the 1995 Geneva Bush Symposium. Engelbart was on the stage with Nelson, Alan Kay, and Tim Berners-Lee. A member of the audience, who I think was Bob Frankston, asks a question of the panel that starts with, "Now, I'm not going to defend Windows, but what I want to try and understand is why Windows is such a problem. If you have to change the world all at once and you can't coexist with what exists, you've got a problem. Do you really feel like you have to change the world all at once?" Engelbart, who had in fact already changed the world by that point, though not all at once, answered him, "The only thing I can say is that you have to pilot software. There has to be some sort of conscious pursuit of that future that you can't really guarantee is there, but nonetheless you need to look. We have to consciously pursue a future that is beneficial. We have to pilot ourselves towards it. I think that's what TED has been doing since 1960. Thank you.
Good points, and thank you very much. First of all, yes, I lost it. Okay, the other point was that it was in 1960 that I foresaw worldwide intercommunication. IBM was going to offer it, so I took it for granted that that was at least one pathway. So when you quoted me as saying that I started thinking of it in 1967, that must have been in some of the context, because the whole notion of worldwide publishing was clear from the beginning. Thanks.
One day you'll let me have a look in your archives, won't you, Ted? Oh, I've left my questions for Rob.